Hi guys, KevLar here. Today we are going to be looking at the recommended PC specs for Grounded 2. So Grounded 2 has recently been released on Steam in early access, and we can see the system requirements on Steam for PC. They have the minimum and recommended requirements. So we are going to go through these now. I'm not going to get too techie into it, just going to explain what some of this means and help you work out where your PC sits in this range. Really, we're going to focus on the three main components: the processor, the memory and the graphics card. The rest of it doesn't really change between the two specs and they don't have a huge impact. So you got Windows 10 or 11 required, DirectX version 12 and a storage space of 40 gigabytes. These are the basic non-negotiable requirements for both minimum and recommended specs. Do note, often they would highlight that the storage should be an SSD or better, so to avoid an HDD mechanical drive. They haven't mentioned this here, but I would suggest this would be the case. So first of all, what does the minimum and recommended requirements really mean? So I would say that the minimum system requirements means that you need these specs to play this game at 720 to 1080p resolution at low to medium settings to get a smooth 30 to 60 FPS. Then the recommended requirements, I would say, is what you need to play the game at 1080 to 1440p resolution to get a smooth 60 FPS plus at the higher graphics settings. So looking at the memory RAM requirements first, as this is the easiest to look at, they suggest 16GB for both the minimum and recommended specs. This doesn't surprise me, as the industry standard for buying or building your own gaming PC these days is 16GB minimum, with 32GB becoming more popular too, since less than 16GB will struggle in a lot of modern games and won't be very future-proof. So it seems anything lower than 16GB will not be suitable for this game. Looking at the graphics card, you've got the minimum specs of an RX 5700, a GTX 1070 or an ARC A580. It's good to see that they've listed a card from each of the main GPU manufacturers. Often the Intel gets missed out. They haven't mentioned the VRAM requirement, but all these GPUs have 8GB of VRAM, so we can safely assume 8GB should be the minimum. And for the recommended specs, you've got the RX 6800 XT or the RTX 3080. No mention of an Intel card here. Maybe there isn't one quite good enough for the higher end. I'm not too hot on the Intel range, so I'm not too sure myself. And again, they haven't specified the VRAM, but RX 6800 XT comes with 16GB and the RTX 3080 has two variants, a 10GB and a 12GB version. So to be cranking up the graphics, the 12GB version sounds more suitable, as the jump from the minimum specs of 8GB to 10 is not really a lot. These recommended cards don't really surprise me for this type of game. Both cards are a few generations old from 2020, and both cards are in the high end at the time and are still good performing cards, and they're a significant jump up from the minimum specs recommended. Best way to understand what this means and where your card sits within the range is on the Tech Power Up website. They have a great tool here where you can select the graphics card and you can see where it sits in relative performance to other cards. So here I search for the recommended RTX 3080, we'll go for the 12GB version, and you can see in this relative performance section it's now selected and it's at 100%. If we scroll down a little bit, we see the other recommended card, the RX 6800 XT, at 93%, so that's showing it's a slightly less powerful card than the 3080. So obviously if you've got a card around this area or above, then you're spot on for the recommended specs. Then if we scroll down lower than this to see where the minimum spec cards sit, we see the GTX 1070 and the RX 570 here at 36% and 41% respectively. So there is a big gap between the minimum and recommended specs. This is a really good sign, as it shows that a lot of systems will be able to handle this game, with the minimum specs being much lower than the recommended, so lowering the settings does make a big difference in allowing lower end PCs to play this game. So you can look at where your GPU sits within this range to see if it's suitable to play the game, and where it sits within this range will help you determine what sort of graphics settings you would be able to play with to get a smooth, higher FPS. And obviously if your GPU sits below the minimum cards that we found here, then it's likely that you will struggle. One more thing I want to say about the graphics cards is on Steam they have a Steam hardware and software survey, which shows the most popular cards of Steam users, and on the latest survey from July 2025, we can see that the RTX 3060 and 4060 are currently the most popular and most used graphic cards. Back to the GPU listing, we can see that they sit at 52% and 61%, so they are above the minimum specs, a fair bit below the recommended specs, but where they are in that range would probably suggest that they are good for medium graphic settings at 1080p. Back to the specs, let's take a look at the processors. So for the minimum specs we have the Ryzen 5 2600 or Intel i5-8400, and recommended specs we have the Ryzen 5 5600X and the Intel i7 10700K. Again, the minimum specs are reasonably low end in this day and age, which is a good sign. Without getting too technical on all the cores, threads, clock speeds, etc., let's go to another website. So Tom's Hardware is usually a good place to go. They have a CPU benchmark list. However, the CPUs listed on the recommended specs are a few years old, so they've dropped off the latest list. So we can go and find the legacy CPU benchmarks hierarchy here. This gives us a nice little graph of some of the CPUs. It doesn't list all CPUs but can give a good guide. So as we can see, the minimum CPUs, the Ryzen 5 2600 and the i5-8400 are down here in this area, and the recommended CPUs, the 5600 and the 10700 are up here. So it's fairly useful to see where your CPU sits within that range to see how far above or below it might be. And you can go to different tables in this website if your CPU is older or newer. Another good way to check your CPU compared to the minimum or recommended specs is to go to Google, and let's say you have a Ryzen 3 1200 CPU and want to see how it's compared to the minimum spec CPU of the Ryzen 2600. Just type it in the search like I have here, and userbenchmark.com is usually the site that comes up top. So if we go into there, and here you go, it puts the two CPUs side by side and gives you a percentage, plus or minus, of how this first CPU is compared to the second one here. It does give some other percentages. I tend to just go for this first one, effective speed, to give us the rough guide. So in this check here, we can see that the recommended CPU, the 2600, is 29% better than the Ryzen 3 1200. So really, if you do have the Ryzen 3 1200, it's too low for the minimum requirements. So you can enter your CPU in here and compare it to the minimum and recommended CPUs to see roughly where yours sits. Right, back to the main specs, and we've covered them all. So if you do get this game, it will be interesting and useful for the other viewers to know how it performs on your specs, as sometimes these recommendations they put on Steam aren't always perfectly accurate. And one caveat at the time of recording is that this game is in early access and there are known optimization and performance issues which the devs are working on patching during the updates within the early access. So as of now, we may not be getting the performance we should do from these recommended specs. Anyway, it'll be useful to know what your specs are and how the game performs for you, so drop us a comment, or if you want some help determining if your specs are suitable, drop us a comment. So that's it from me. I hope you found that useful. Please do give us a like and subscribe, and I'll catch you in the next video. Cheers.